The CPI report, Child Protection in Iowa, brought to you by Vocal, Victims of Child Abuse Laws. You can watch our program on Mediacom Channel 15, Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock. Again, it's repeated Wednesday evening at 9:30. You can email us at vocaliowa@mchsi.com. My telephone number here in Des Moines, Iowa, 515-276-3956. Or you can call John at area code 515-282-2672. My name is Don Burgmaier, and with me at the controls is my co-host,
John Harvey, and welcome to the CPI report. CPI, that stands for Child Protection in Iowa. There's a couple of major efforts that we strive for. Number one is to influence public policy as it relates to child protection issues. And secondly, we like to work with families who call upon us to assist them in problems with the Department of Human Services and the juvenile court. We're not attorneys, so we cannot practice law before the bar. We do know a little bit about the law and about how parents should behave themselves with social workers in order to get the kind of relief that they need to protect their families and to secure the kind of family integrity that is required for families to function properly. Well, we've got a couple of things we want to do on our program today, so we're going to move right along. We're going to call upon Terrance Walker, who usually gives us a good review of what's happening in the court system, because without that court system, anything that we attempt to do with respect to changing things with the Department of Human Services and other areas is to no avail. So we're going to have to look toward such things as court review in order to improve the situation. Following that, we'll have a 36-minute presentation of the school law for Iowa the last 150 years. So you're going to find a scholar stepping forward, a scholar who practices as an attorney in Ames, Iowa, Craig Hastings. So we're going to hear both from Terrance Walker and later on from Craig Hastings, who has a very academically polished report to give us on Iowa history, Iowa school history. Here now, ready to reform the system, and I'm hoping can bring about some reform to the prosecutorial system as well as the court system, is Terrance Walker. Terrance?
Well, thanks a lot, John. I always appreciate your warm greetings and introductions. I think that it's a tall order that we have to serve to inform the public about what's really going on, because a lot of the officials, what they can do in a lot of instances is misinform us. And by misinforming us or uninform us, they can basically keep their jobs and keep out of the limelight and make sure that they conduct business as usual. And in a lot of instances, earn their six-figure paychecks and without doing anything out of the ordinary or without too much effort. What I want to talk about is what I feel are cartoon characters. And I got one in particular here that I don't know if you remember Duck Dodgers, Plan 8 from Upper Mars. It's a good cartoon back in the 60s. I think it was made in the 60s or 70s, but they replayed it plenty of times. It's very popular. Daffy Duck, ducking and dodging. Because we've got a lot of officials in this state, it seems, that like to duck and dodge. They don't want to have responsibility. I think it was Teddy Roosevelt said, the typical vice of American politics is the avoidance of saying anything real on real issues. Well, in that vein, I want to continue talking about the state of the judiciary. Now, we're going to give you the real to the real state of the judiciary, not the state of the judiciary that ducks and dodges the real issues. We're going to talk about the real issues that's affecting the judiciary as it pertains to Iowa. Because we really didn't get to cover in detail the past couple episodes the full text and the full meat and potatoes of the judicial state of the judiciary that was made on January 16th of 2008, which was delivered by Judge Marcia Terrance. I just wanted to pick up on a couple lines that she stated at the beginning of the state of the judiciary. She stated that the role of the judicial branch is evident to administer justice according to law equally to all people. She's also stated in the opening part of this state of the judiciary that while she's proud of the solid performance, I am not here to take comfort in the current state of affairs. What are those current state of affairs? Well, the Des Moines Register and the Iowa Independent and several other newspapers here in Iowa, and also the TV stations, news forecasts or news programs, have been reporting all fall and all last year that Iowa leads the nation for imprisoning blacks at a rate 13.6 times that of whites. And while blacks account for 2.3% of Iowa's population, but 25% of its prison population, this was what the DC-based sentencing project stated last year. And according to the state of judiciary, Iowa has solid performance, according to Judge Marcia Terrance, in the area of the providing justice according to law equally to all people. Now, it would be to misinform us or uninform us, or to not even take any responsibility or any action on this, to not even speak to any strategy to combat this rating or combat this state of affairs. But this is what we're facing here in the era of duck dodgers in the judiciary here in the state of Iowa. Because as we read the state of the judiciary text, which was it's on the judicial website for the state of Iowa, www.judicial.state.ia.us, or you can just do a search for Iowa Supreme Court website, and you should be able to pull it up and look up for the state of the judiciary. You will not see anything addressing the fact that Iowa has the worst disparity rate of any state as far as the sentencing is concerned in the United States. And so what we have here is a clear case of duck dodgers, and I just wanted to point that out and give people the real on the state of the judiciary, because the state of the judiciary that was pointed out by Justice Marcia Terrance is not given the true state of affairs. One other order of business here I wanted to cover is the fact that there's 17 Iowans have applied for the judicial position that's vacant. It's going to be vacant on May 17th on the Iowa Supreme Court when Justice Jerry Larson retires. Now the 17 applicants are listed on the Iowa Supreme Court website. Again, that's www.judicial.state.ia.us. and this these group of people, these 17 people, are supposed to be becoming for like a kind of like a review, and 3 of the nominees will be selected from these group of applicants by the Judicial Nominating Commission, which will meet on the 6th and 7th of March. And the commission welcomes written comments from the public about the qualifications of any applicants, and the comments must be submitted to the state court administrator, who serves as the commission secretary, by March 5th. And the state court administrator's address is 1111 East Court Avenue, and that's in Des Moines, 50319. Again, that's 1111 East Court Avenue, 50319 here in Des Moines. And you want to address that to the state court administrator, and make sure that you point out that these are comments on the applicants. Now, you want to take a look at the list of applicants. I noticed right away one judge that I'm sort of familiar with, Judge David Danielson of Boone. I've experienced the way he also acts as Duck Dodgers in his courtroom. So, you got to really go over these and give the process a little bit of time to work. But, I would definitely, if I were you, I'd definitely go over some of these lists of judges.
Noticed Arthur Gamble is there. Did you notice that?
Yeah, Arthur Gamble. I'm not familiar too much with him. I know was the chief judge of chief judge of the
5th District.
5th Judicial District, which covers Des Moines and Polk County and some of the surrounding counties. Did you have any comments on Judge Gamble?
Personally, several years ago, he did something that I disagreed with, but it was a small issue. Didn't really hurt me too much. But then just recently, I did get a positive response a couple times from him. That's I really appreciate. Overall, he's a typical judge. That's all I have to say.
So is that good or bad?
I wouldn't take a gamble.
Okay. Don't gamble, because you might not get justice. You might be gambling for justice. But I would say vote no, or definitely make some comments on Judge Danielson from Boone, because I'm going to definitely write up something and address the commission on what I've experienced in his courtroom. Well, the guy's, appears to be nice, and at first, you get to, when you get the real meat and potatoes of what he's writing and his opinions or whatnot, you see that he can tend to omit a great deal of arguments. And, I think that to be complete as a judge, you should be, if you're not going, I know you can't get a favorable ruling in all courts at all times, but by the same token, I think to be a fair judge, they would still have to adequately explain the reasoning and fully cover the issues that are being raised in the court proceedings that they're adjudicating. And I think that this judge does not do that. So, if we're going to continue with the era of Duck Dodgers, then yeah, you probably would want to elect him. But if we want to get rid of this avoidance issue and get on to having a better justice system here in Iowa, then I think we need to definitely not have Judge Danielson as part of the Iowa Supreme Court, especially. It's bad enough that he's in a district court. But that's all I had to state. Did you have any other issues? That's all I had for the judiciary as it pertained to the Iowa state of the judiciary. And I just wanted to give you the real to the real and inform you so that you can be informed. So, because otherwise they're going to uninform you and misinform you.
One comment I got, don't depend on first impression of a judge. A judge can be very courteous to you, call you by your first name or your last name, and really beef you up, encourage you, But then over the years, if you continue to have experience with this very polite judge, he works and where his money comes from the state. And that's controlling to him. And so you know how his rulings will come out in the end. And so if you don't work for the state or are not paid by the state, you might try to stay away from a judge like that. It's got that kind of an appearance. John?
No, go ahead.
Oh, I'm done.
Okay.
I'm done with that, Judge.
We'll go back to Terrance.
Okay. Well, I thought I was done, but I guess I'll finish.
Okay.
I'll finish. So one more point I did want to make.
Speaking of points, Terrance has got another point.
Exactly. We're gonna keep the real to the real going here. Now, when I speak of the state of the judiciary that was announced or that was actually made by the Chief Judge, Marcia Terrance, on the 16th of January this year, again, I reiterate, she said the role of the judicial branch is evident to administer justice equally to all people, according to law. Now, I would think that a responsible judge in her position, knowing that there's been a couple of different reports highlighting the biases of the court system here in Iowa and showing that they've actually demonstrating that they do have disparities as far as sentencing, charging, and all that, as far as it pertains to minorities and blacks here in the state. I would think that if this true state of the judiciary message would encompass something that would definitely include not only that information, but also include a strategy to combat the proven and documented biases within the state of Iowa's judicial system. And so I think that, Governor Carver, we need to talk to our legislatures about getting on this and getting on these judges. And if they're not going to act, and they're going to act like there's not an issue, we should definitely vote them out coming this fall. And that's what I'd have to say on that issue.
Okay. Noting that there are some discrepancies and disparities with respect to sentencing primarily, what would be the easiest way to zip through to a resolution of that difficulty, other than judges recognizing that there is a problem?
Well, I think for one, they need to be educated. I mean, when you have the chief judge that is obviously not taking this as a serious issue or not even acting like it's an issue, for one, it's just going to continue the problem. And if you look at that quote under the Duck Dodgers cartoon that I got there, it states, and this is a quote from Duck Dodgers, the actual cartoon, "If he is our future, then history will not repeat itself because we will all be dead." And I think that's kind of indicative of the situation, because not only will history won't repeat itself, we'll all be dead. Black people will continue to be in ballooning, alarming numbers in prison here in the state of Iowa, and we'll have it'll have a catastrophic effect not only on our population, but we got to look at it from the standpoint that our populations are interdependent of each other. And if black people continue to suffer, I mean, everybody's going to continue to suffer, because justice as a whole will suffer in the state of Iowa. And that's not the true mission of the judiciary. But I think education, for one, is would be the main way to combat it. And then we need to have some training as far as judges. I mean, some of the judges, they have everybody has biases, everybody has prejudices. The only way that we can combat that is by getting information that's pertinent to every culture in the minds of these judges. The judges are not going to be good judges just because they have schooling from an educational institution that teaches them law. They also have to have some sort of sensitivity training that would enhance them in their understanding of the different cultures and the different people that are in their courtrooms. So I think that's the main emphasis that I would like to highlight as what would be the solution, which would, combat some of the problems here in the state of Iowa. And then, there also should be a sanction. It should also be like some sort of benchmark or goal to make sure and monitor that there's some progress in this area. And then if there's certain judges that are definitely way out of those metrics, we also should consider removing those judges. So that would be my multi-pronged approach to solutions of that problem in that area.
So many problems are rising in this area of judges and prosecutorial misconduct. I think of the Nifong principle, in which a judge can do about anything he wants. I'm not a judge, a prosecutor, and they're held with very little accountability. You don't see these people being fired for misconduct, but indeed they certainly are engaged in misconduct from time to time to the detriment of the citizenry. And in fact, we've read a couple of stories just recently, dates back years and years of when people were thrown in prison for molesting children. Come to find out, they never did. But the way prosecutors put the cases together, it makes it appear as though some of those things were happening. Well, we did promise that we're going to listen to, if the tape works properly, we're going to listen to a fellow who is going to tell us a little bit about Iowa school history. And I think you're going to find some of the subject matter to be of great interest. You're going to hear a lot of little children in the audience making quite a racket. But I still think that we can piece out what the gentleman is saying as he's going up for a PhD at Iowa State University in area of history, having served as an attorney in Story County in Ames, Iowa. The name of the gentleman is Craig Hastings, and we'll try to get his name up here before long. And in any case, here now we'll turn to listen to a presentation by Craig Hastings.
Doing transactional law instead. But I do appreciate that, appreciate the opportunity to come here. It's, wow. As we started out, none of you guys would have been daring to show your face down here because most homeschoolers in Iowa were underground. We didn't have quite that problem when we started out, but we had a very friendly local school district guy who was a believer. This is fantastic to see all out here. I've been asked to give you a kind of a background on homeschool law in Iowa, and it's a topic that I'm quite interested in. Okay. It's a topic I'm quite interested in because I was telling Justin, and I guess you heard before, after about 35
This sound will pick up a little bit because he's going to pick up the microphone.
And I'm enrolled in the PhD program in Iowa State in history. The reason for that is that having been involved with homeschool in many of the cases that you'll study if you ever study that history, I just really felt a burden to tell the story of the people that
You'll see a team working, helping him correct the microphone problem.
Write a book on the whole era when we went through that. Decided if I was going to do all that work, I might as well get some more letters behind my name. I don't do this very often. I taught a college class at Campus Baptist Church in Ames for over 30 years, and I speak from an outline almost exclusively, but there's enough detail in this history, and I know that we have homeschool kids here. Homeschool kids like history, right? Okay, so can we turn it up? If I'm speaking loud, I'm going to start losing my voice here. I just hold it. How that work? Okay. How's that work? Okay. I said. So I usually work from an outline, but there's enough detail here that I am going to bore you to tears by reading my paper. But I'll try to make it as entertaining as possible. I will throw in a few lawyer jokes to see if you're awake, and we'll go from there. You heard about the group of thugs that decided to invade the retired lawyers club and going to go in there and rob them. And boy, those guys gave them a real fight for their money. And the thugs got out the door and kind of reconnoitered over by the curb and said, "Man, that was hard. But at least we got out of there with $50." And one of the other ones looked at him and said, "You idiot! We went in there with 100." So, a brief history of education, compulsory education law, and it's really a history of compulsory education, not homeschool law, because the only reason we're here today is because there's a compulsory education law. Now, some people snidely call it a compulsory attendance law. I'm going to use those terms somewhat interchangeably, but of course there is a difference. You can't talk about the history of the compulsory education law in Iowa without putting it in the context of what was going on in the United States with respect to compulsory education. And the history of that compulsory education law in Iowa and the United States is a history of the struggle over who should control the education of children, the parents or the state. And so we have to look at that, and we understand in that struggle there were religious aspects. We're going to find, surprisingly, I was surprised when I researched it, there were political aspects here in Iowa, and you might be surprised who was on which side of the battle. And it also has rural-urban aspects to it, very much so here in Iowa. Now, the fact that there's all this shouldn't surprise anybody that's been involved in homeschool. As Justin said, we started homeschooling our children. They have gone to a little tiny church school, Ames Baptist Church School, for a little bit, and then we homeschooled them for about 5 or 6, 7 years, and then they finished up at Grandview Park Baptist School. And so I was involved, but I was involved actually in trying cases that started really in the late 70s. And what surprised me is I went back and did the research, because when you're trying cases, you don't have time to do anything except, prepare for that. And I had not really done the research that I've done now, and I find it a very interesting story. I hope you'll find it interesting too. Compulsory education laws were passed in the United States from a period between 1852 and 1929. Now, each of those dates is the tail end, because the first one was passed in Massachusetts in 1852. They were followed in 1864 by the District of Columbia and Vermont in 1867. Most of the compulsory education laws, however, were passed from the period 1871 to 1918, and the tail ender was Alaska. They didn't pass theirs until 1929. Where do you suppose the great state of Iowa that prides itself on its public education system was on that list? And the answer is they were the 35th state. They were the last state in the northern and western states, the last state outside of the old Confederate states to pass a compulsory education law. And they didn't do that until 1902. Why? And that's the interesting story that I'm going to try to tell you. The fact that they were a bit of a laggard isn't actually so surprising. There's a great book by a professor named Paul Theobald, who used to teach at North Dakota. I think he's out at a university out east and it's called Call School, Rural Education in the Midwest to 1918. And here's what he says about the struggle over education in general and who will control it. Rural educational history has been marked by pervasive resistance to state-sponsored schooling and school initiatives. Free public schools were the first systematic industrial imposition on agrarian life in the United States. Secular, state-directed schooling, which, remember, was a response to industrial problems, especially the notion that concentrated population led to a crisis among children. In addition, it was supposed that immigration could possibly usurp the American democratic process. Many believed that a Roman Pope would dictate the United States policy by directing the vote of Catholic Americans. These were not rural concerns, and thus a secular solution proposed by many of New England's urbanites, the state-controlled common school, was frequently resisted by Midwest's rural yeomanry. that from Paul Theobald. As a result of this resistance, some interesting alliances developed. Some were religious, some were political. Theobald argues that in the Midwest, the debate was less about whether to have free schools, and I have to interject here. We all know there's no such thing as a free school. That's the term that's always used in these researches, and I remember reading the chapter in Theobald, writing the note, there's no such thing as a free school. It gets paid for either voluntarily or involuntarily out of our pockets, but that's the word that they use, so just understand that that's where I'm coming from. He shows that in the debate, the parties arrayed against one another were generally religiously based. And on one side, what he calls the Calvinist Puritan side, were old school Presbyterians and Congregationalists, along with some Unitarians. On the other side were what he called the Pietists, Baptists, Methodists, and the revivalist split-offs from the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists, like the Church of Christ, as you know that full story. The educational professionals were allied on the Calvinist Puritan side, even though some of them, particularly Horace Mann, was not a clergyman, nor was he especially religious. On the Pietist side were most of the rural religious folk who were strongly influenced by Methodist and Baptist missionaries who had come into the Midwest. When Iowa became a state in 1846, the very first Constitution stated that the General Assembly was to provide for a, quote, system of common schools. However, it was 56 years later that the compulsory education law was passed in 1902. And that is indicative of all of the struggles that were going to take place during that 50 to 60 years in Iowa over this common school system. Lots of issues. How should the school be organized? Should it be graded? In other words, grades 1, 2, 3, or should it be ungraded? That was a big battle over whether we should go to graded schools. Should there be common schools beyond the grammar school level? That is, high schools. They came in very late in that history. Who should select the teachers? How should they be selected? How should they be paid? What should their qualifications be? Many of you know, back in those days, the high school or one-room school teacher basically probably had an 8th grade education. That's very, very common. Should the school districts provide textbooks? That was a big debate. Back in the early days, when kids went to one-room school, they brought their own textbooks with them from home, and they weren't provided by the school district. Who would choose the curriculum? Each of these issues involved a tug-of-war. On the one side was the educational establishment comprising the Department of Education, the professors that were beginning to train teachers in Iowa's colleges. Incidentally, the first Department of Teacher Training in the United States was at the University of Iowa. Iowa's a unique state. We have a lot of firsts that way. On the other side were many, and these were all the Calvinist Puritans that Theobald described. On the other side were local school boards composed mainly of farmers and their supporters, the Baptists and the Methodists. The authority of the local school boards was challenged by this new law and the prospect of additional legislation that local opponents feared would diminish their own authority, including their authority to hire their teachers, determine curriculum, and set the tax rate on their own property for the support of their local school. Critics of these farmers argue that the debate was really just about these cheapskate farmers who didn't want to pay taxes. But Theobald and one of the leading experts on the history of one-room schools, Wayne Ford, say that the case was more often a debate that was a principled one over who was going to control the education of their children. The criticisms put forth by the professional educators, and this is going to be, as Yogi Berra said, deja vu all over again. You're going to hear the same stuff from this history that you're hearing over there. They just repeat the same stuff over and over again. Here are the criticisms. They were basically attacking the rural school teacher, and the rural family. And because after the Civil War, rural school teachers switched dramatically. Before the Civil War, most rural school teachers were male. After the Civil War, they became predominantly female. The ratio was like 5 to 1 male to female before, and 10 to 1 female to male after the Civil War. And so when they attacked the rural school teachers, they were attacking women, fundamentally. The professional educators argued that rural school organization, especially the independent district, resulted in too many school districts, each with their own board elected by local farmers. This in turn wasted money, they argued, because of the need to pay all the rural school district officers. As the small district had a limited tax base, the result was, they argued, many small school buildings insufficiently constructed and maintained, populations of students taught in a single ungraded classroom without proper textbooks, and most of all, they said, they were taught by poorly paid and poorly trained teachers. The professional educators made steady progress over the period from 1858 into the 1890s, implementing their agenda. In 1858, the legislature hired a board of a commission of 3 people to come in and consult with them on drafting a new school law. Guess who the head of that commission was? Horace Mann. Horace Mann at the time was the president of, I think, Antioch College, and he had been the superintendent out in Massachusetts, and it's always called the father of the public school system. So Mann was hired to come in, and his proposal was to do all these things that they said, consolidate districts and have more state control. The recommendation was that each district would have a locally elected board, would set tax rates, but it would also involve more state control. The legislature rejected the commission's recommendation that a state board of education be established, but they did adopt some of the others. Years ago, and I discovered this when I was doing a paper for a class I took last week, and it's amazing, an historian named Clarence Arner has written a 5-volume history of education in Iowa from 1850 to 1920. So you can imagine how detailed it is. And Arner talks about the effect of this law on the local school teacher, who was, in effect, an entrepreneur at that time. There's what he says. For 20 years, covering the territorial and more than a decade of the state's history, there were teachers in all communities acting on their own account, collecting a fee from each child taught, or they were paid in part from public funds and in part from the proceeds of a bill given to the students. During this period, property did not support the public school and provide for the education of all children. It was systemized the work of the district organization. None of that was there. The early teachers made their own systems, recommended their own textbooks, manufactured their own apparatus, and collected their own bills. This entire system, however, never had a requirement that kids go. There was not a compulsory education law. And you'd think that the lack of a compulsory attendance law would have a devastating consequence on literacy of Iowans at this time. But that is not the case. If you use literacy as a rough approximation for one's education, then by any account, Iowans were quite well educated in the basic skills of reading and writing. During the period from 1880 to 1900, it is generally asserted by all historians that Iowans had the highest literacy rate in the United States. Charlotte Cordier, one of the historians of this era, attributes it to the low ratio of children to teachers. Of course, always wanted to credit the public school system. Others attribute it to the large number of local schools. But here's the problem, and I've done the research on this. Every 2 years, the state director, superintendent, they changed the name over time, of public instruction, from 1860 forward, and these are in the Iowa State Library, prepared a biennial report. And in those biennial reports, they report the number of school-aged children, which at that time was generally from age 5 to age 21, and how many of those school-aged children were enrolled in a public school, and then how many on the average attended. Okay, two big, very different numbers. And this data for the period 1850 to 1900, and I took every 10 years, I didn't do all of them, I looked at every 10th year, show that no more than 3/4 of all school-aged children were even enrolled in school, and on the average, less than half of the school-aged children attended school. The question has to be asked then, where did Iowa's children learn to read and write? That's a dumb question in this room, isn't it? But you know what? It's really hard to find actual hard evidence of what we're all assuming is they learn to read and write at home. It's really hard to find evidence. Any of you out there, because I'm going to be doing my PhD thesis research, if you've got old diaries, old letters where grandma said, hey, I taught my kid to read and write, you send them to me, okay? Because I'm really interested in that information. I've asked some of the older people in our church, who went to one-room schools. I asked one other gentleman, did you go to a one-room school? Yes, he said, school number 4, something township. He still remembered the township and the number. I said, where did you learn to read and write? And he looked at me and he kind of said, I can't remember. So if you've got any information, it's really hard to find that. One of the leading experts on literacy, history of literacy in the United States, Carl Castle, describes the campaign in the Lutheran Church of Sweden to increase literacy, again, religiously based. And this is going to have an Iowa tie-in. His description is interesting because it gives us a clue. The big surge in Swedish literacy occurred between 1660, when the national rate was 35%, and 1720, when it reached 90%. At that time, Sweden was overwhelmingly agrarian. The literacy campaign was instituted by the Lutheran Church and was implemented with little emphasis on schools. Families were directed by their pastors to teach their children to read or get them taught, and the pastors monitored the progress. The reason this story is interesting is that the one piece of evidence I found for people learning to read and write at home was a story in the Palimpsest, which is an Iowa publication still being published in 1942 edition. Dean Seashore tells of his arrival in Dayton, Iowa in 1869 with his fellow Swedish immigrants. There was no school, and there weren't enough children then because you couldn't, the school basically had to be within 2-mile walking distance. And so the schools were organized on a township basis, they had to divide them in sub-districts in order to put a school on the corner like you see out in rural Iowa that was within 2 miles. There weren't enough kids to do that, and so they couldn't have a school because they would have had to walk too far. So what he did, he said they had to wait till 1873 to divide, but that did not stop the education. Here's Seashore's account. During the years of waiting for a schoolhouse, education was not neglected. Instruction was given in homes and in cooperative activities which were conducted in Swedish. There were no illiterate immigrants, and every child of my age could read, write, and spell in Swedish before he entered school. And that's the one piece of direct evidence I have that homeschoolers were educating all these highly literate Iowans. Kessel shows that increasing literacy did not just affect rates among the sons, but also the daughters. It turns out that female literacy was highly correlated to proximity school, but it wasn't necessarily connected. It was primarily connected with female participation in the church. And the reason was that the females needed to be educated in order to catechize their children at home. And so the education of women in New England was very important. And most of the immigrants that we have here in Iowa, early years, came through New England and Pennsylvania to Iowa. So the New England heritage of homeschooling is a very important part of our heritage here in Iowa. Joseph Kirshner, the only other source I found, asserts that most children could read and write by the time they were 8 or 9 as a result of mother's influence. So despite the fact Iowa had high literacy rates, why was there a push to have a compulsory education law? I struck gold. I found an article that gives this history, and I'm going to give full credit to Carol Engelhardt in the Annals of Iowa, who wrote the history of this debate. Compulsory education laws, as you recall, were primarily motivated by the fear in the eastern big cities that all these immigrants were coming in and they weren't going to get, become good Americans. They weren't going to be 100% Americans. It was also interesting for another reason that we'll talk in a little bit. And it's a reasonable concern because between 1877 and 1900, over 10 million immigrants came to the United States. Our population at the time was about 75 million. So it's a huge percentage. That's over 10% of our existing population coming in during those 13, 14, 20 years. So there were political differences because many of these immigrants were from southern European countries, not from England and Scandinavia, but from Italy and things like that. And we all know about the old stereotypes and the prejudice that immigrants face. Do you think it's bad today? It's the same stuff back then. And Engelhardt summarized it this way: Republicans, and this is where your mind's going to get a little twisted around from what we have today. Republicans favored using limited state authority in the form of school legislation to promote civic responsibility and cultural homogeneity. Democrats, advocating cultural tolerance and parental rights, resisted increases of state power.
Despite opposition by Democrats, Republican governors and legislators successfully passed compulsory attendance laws in most northern states during the 3 decades following the Civil War. So it was the Republicans who were on the side of compulsory education, not the Democrats. The early motivation for compulsory education in Iowa came from the cities. And in particular, a man named Henry Sabin, who was in 1872 the superintendent of schools in Clinton, Iowa, started writing promoting compulsory education. And here's what he said. He said there were too many boys, sorry, the boys, innocent. You know, it's not the girls, it's the boys. There were too many boys loitering on the street when they should be in school. And of course, this was going to lead to crime and poverty, threatening the very existence of the Republic. Others followed this line of reasoning, and in that year, and really from the beginning, compulsory education laws were introduced in the legislature, but they never passed. The Republican governors would introduce them, they passed one house, but they never get through both of them. As I say, most of this was because of rural resistance. States as close to us as Illinois and Wisconsin passed their bills in the 1870s, but it's a very, very different story because Wisconsin at that time was the 10th leading industrial producing state in the country. So they had big cities and industrial production. Illinois also. Iowa didn't. Iowa's local control of education was an essential belief, and they thought that attendance laws were just going to be a precursor to more state control. Surprising? E.H. Thayer, a Democratic legislator and a newspaperman from the same city, Clinton, wrote this in 1876. I believe that a compulsory education law is anti-American, anti-Republican, anti-democratic. It may do in a monarchy where all is forced and compulsory, but in a free society is unjust, wrong, and unconstitutional. That from a Democratic legislator. Because of this sentiment, even some of the educational establishment were split. And there were certain superintendents that did not go along with the idea of compulsory education. However, they lost out. In 1888, Henry Sabin, our superintendent from Clinton, became the state superintendent of public instruction. And in 1890, there was actually a meeting of farmers in Des Moines that endorsed the concept of compulsory education, thus abandoning what had been typically a farmer resistance. Why did this come about? Well, religion came into the mix. During the 1880s, the prohibition campaign, the campaign to have national prohibition was going into full swing. Republicans, who were supported by rural, native-born, and Protestant constituencies, intensified their campaign to enforce prohibition. Democrats, representing urban, foreign-born, and Catholic constituencies, opposed it. But the Republican side was split because a large part of their constituency was German and Scandinavian Lutherans, and they didn't support prohibition. So they divided, and in 1889, a Democratic governor and 65 Democratic legislators were elected. This delayed the campaign for compulsory education, of course, but it also allowed time for the German Lutherans to look next door because Wisconsin had passed what they called the Bennett Law. And the Bennett Law had provisions in it that would have outlawed the Lutheran parochial schools. And this scared the German Lutherans to death, as well as the German Catholics. In Wisconsin, the German Lutherans left the Republican Party and voted with the German Catholics to get the Bennett Law, the portions they objected to, repealed. The Iowa education establishment looked on this in dismay. An 1890 editorial from the Iowa Normal, monthly Normal School, the state college paper stated, quote, the right of the state is clearly to insist that all its subjects, doesn't that language just put a chill up and down your back? That all its subjects be educated in the language of this country. The hostility of the Catholic and Lutheran clergy is wholly inexcusable and indefensible. Not deterred by this opposition from the Lutherans and the Catholics, the educational establishment pressed ahead. In 1900, Henry Sabin's successor, Richard Bennett, urged again the passage of the compulsory attendance law. He argued, quote, the moral growth and material prosperity of our people are threatened daily by the failure of so large a number to avail themselves of the advantages offered by the free school system. And so in 1902, the legislature finally passed the first law, but it was a struggle. What happened was that this was the heyday of the progressive movement. And one of the leaders of the progressive movement in the United States was actually in Iowa. His name was Albert Cummins. He became a leader nationally, and he also became the governor of the state of Iowa. And although he was a Republican, he was a progressive, and progressives believed in compulsory education. And so he started pushing this. Now, this coincided also with a start in the decline of rural schools, because the rural population of Iowa peaked in about 1910 and started declining. The number of one-room schools in Iowa peaked in 1900. That was its high point, and it started declining after that. In addition, there were other, in effect, defections. The Federation of Women's Clubs, a largely town and city group, was joined by the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, to pass a resolution at their conventions in 1899. Now, on the other side of the battle were the Catholics and the Lutherans. Both of them operated substantial parochial school systems, as they do today. And they feared the compulsory attendance law could be used to destroy these systems, which was not a trivial objection. Their objections were placated, however, because the sponsor of the bill in the legislature, George Dunham from Manchester, basically lobbied some prominent German or Lutheran and Catholic churchmen, and they changed the bill. And the key section of it, and here's what the 1902 Act, our original compulsory education law, was Chapter 128 of the Iowa Code, and here's what it says. Section 1, duties of parents or guardians, penalty. Any person having control of any child of the age of 7 to 14 years inclusive, in proper physical and mental condition to attend school, shall cause such child to attend, and here was the key language that got the Lutherans and the Catholics over on the side, shall attend some public, private, or parochial school. And with that language, they came over, and that's where we got the first compulsory attendance law. The statute goes on to say, the very first one goes on to say, where the common school branches of reading, writing, spelling, arithmetic, grammar, geography, and here's the one that just came out and hit me. I couldn't believe it. The next subject you had to teach was physiology. I don't know, and United States history are taught. Or, and here's the language that gets us in the play here. This is the language in the very first compulsory education statute in the state of Iowa in 1902. It says, or, in other words, after private, public, or parochial, it says, or to attend upon equivalent instruction by a competent teacher elsewhere than at school. And that's where the first law was, and that's where homeschooling came under, is competent teacher elsewhere than at school. Now, passing the compulsory attendance law was not a panacea that the people that supported it thought, because it's one thing to pass the law, it's another thing to enforce it. And there was no enforcement going on. And in fact, the papers came out and said, well, you know, the reason that there's no enforcement is all these foreigners, these foreign parents who resent the city's interference in the management and government of their children. And here's the other essential point, this newspaper editorialist said the other problem is all these employers that hire kids. And so the other part of the history of compulsory education law is that all the compulsory education laws eventually were bolstered by child labor laws, okay? Because parents didn't want to send their kids to school if they could go work. Now, that's a big problem out east where you've got all the factories, right? You don't want these kids laboring in Robert Blake's dark satanic mills. But what about being out in the fields? Okay? You can see why the rural population in Iowa wasn't real fond of compulsory education, nor were they fond of child labor laws. And so the battle over this was a very interesting one. Now, I might also point out that I checked this, and during the time period from 1870 to 1920, which brackets the compulsory education law passing in 1902, the average enrollment in Iowa schools was stuck at 75%. For all I could tell, the compulsory education law didn't make a bit of difference as to the number of kids enrolled. Attendance did go up slightly from 1900 to 1912, and a little more substantially from 1912 to 1920. So the obvious solution was to do two things: hire truant officers and pass a child labor law. And what's interesting about this is the economist, I'm an econ major as an undergraduate, so I kind of find an interest in these things. This has been a big area of research by economists doing regression analysis to see the correlation between compulsory education laws, child labor laws, and school attendance. And I have to say that it's a very, very mixed bag. There's a real question whether the laws were effective in increasing school attendance. Some people argue that actually the reverse happened, that school attendance went up and child labor went down, and then the laws were passed. Because if you think about it, since the number of farmers and farms was declining in Iowa, the need for kids working on the farm was going down. Kids didn't need to work as much, in labor like that, and so basically they were just following what the population, where the population was already going. Clarence Enson's study of the effect of compulsory attendance and child labor laws, which is the major study, by the way, and it comes out of Iowa City back in the 1920s, says this: even with the imperfect data available, it can be shown that illiteracy in the states considered, and he's considered basically five states in the United States, one of which was Wisconsin. Illiteracy in the states considered has not increased at such a rate as to make it comparable inversely to the increase in school attendance. In other words, he's a proponent of compulsory education laws. He says the increase in school attendance in these five states studied did not increase the rate of literacy and had no effect on that. Once passed, the Iowa compulsory attendance law became a vehicle for the educational establishment to promote its other goals. Engelhardt comments, once passed, compulsory education advanced curricular change and increased state supervision in Iowa just as it did in other states. It was the camel poking its nose into the tent. And in 1904, the law was first amended, right 2 years after the first law. It increased the age from 12 to 16, and it required schools over 20,000, cities over 20,000 to get a truant officer. An exception was passed in 2009 for religious attendance. They increased the number of weeks of school. They then made an exception if you got 8th grade equivalency. That came in 1913. In 1923, they added the principles of American government as a required subject, probably as a result of World War I, and they also prohibited instruction in foreign languages under 9th grade because of World War I. The original 1902 Act, which allowed a child to attend an equivalent instruction by a competent teacher, also had a reporting requirement. It was simply to say who the kid was and the period of time he'd been under private instruction. A little bit different than the reports we have to file today. In 23, they added the details of the instruction, the name of the instructor, and in 1953, an ominous development, they changed the word competent to certified. And that's what we fought all through the 70s and 80s, was the certified teacher requirement. In 1988, they did the reporting requirement. In 89, they did certified. They changed to licensed. Now, the history of the 91 change is well stated in other histories. Sarah Leslie wrote an article about that. And so I want to close with this final quote from a feminist historian, but I think it's an interesting one. In the last third of the 19th century, systems of mass compulsory schooling were established in most countries of the Western world. What was at stake was not literacy or school attendance as such. High rates of literacy and almost universal school enrollment and intermittent attendance were common.
You've been viewing a lecture by Craig Hastings on Iowa school history. We'll see you next week.
And the imposition of the one model of efficient schooling. As teachers assume more total power in local parentis over educational